Please welcome the President of the John Birch Society, Mr. John F. McManus.
Got your water? Yeah, it's there. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's always good to be back in Oklahoma. I think I've been speaking more here in Oklahoma than any other state in the Union recently, and that's good. My topic is the United Nations. As most of us know, October is the month set aside to celebrate the UN, if you want to celebrate it. The initial meeting of the General Assembly, the actual birth of the UN, occurred in October 1945. So that means it's 65 years old. And we're again in October, and we're supposed to celebrate along with the rest of mankind, but I don't suppose that there are too many people in this audience who want to celebrate. But we can acknowledge U.S. presence in the world body for the past 65 years. 65 years too many. 65 years in which our nation has paid and continues to pay a heavy price. Now, world government has been the goal of a conspiracy against God and man throughout history. Right? You can find that out by going back to the Tower of Babel. Right? It has been the formal goal of conspirators since 1776, when Adam Weishaupt's Illuminati was born. From Weishaupt, the plot continued under Mazzini and the Carbonari, then to Marx and the rise of communism and socialism, and on to Edward Mandell House and the call for world government he issued in his revealing book, Philip Drew, Administrator. And of course, there were many other minor players in the plot over the years. There was a significant try at world government in the aftermath of World War I. The League of Nations did in fact become a reality, but our nation refused to join, and that doomed the League to irrelevancy right from its inception. Right? A few stalwart senators scuttled that plan in 1919. When the Senate turned thumbs down on the League, Woodrow Wilson's Edward Mandell House and his young lieutenants were in Paris working on the Versailles Treaty arrangement. They immediately met with counterparts from England, very disappointed that the U.S. Senate did not plunge itself into this League of Nations. And out of that meeting came England's Royal Institute for International Affairs and the U.S.-based Council on Foreign Relations, right? Directly a result of our not joining the League of Nations in 1919. John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles were among the lieutenants of Edward Mandell House, and of course they were labeled as conservatives and anti-communists during the Eisenhower administration. Truth took a beating there. The goal from day one of the Council on Foreign Relations, as you know, has been world government. Right? Now there were numerous people who said that because the League of Nations did not include the United Nations, it would never become the sought-after world government. So moves were immediately taken in the early 1920s to bring on another world war as soon as possible. We know that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had a relationship with Edward Mandell House as early as 1920, when the future president's mother gave him a copy of Philip Drew, House's book. Right? And after he won the Democrat Party's nomination for president in 1932, Roosevelt immediately journeyed to Gloucester, Massachusetts to visit an old man in his summer home, Edward Mandell House. The first person he went to see after he won the nomination was Edward Mandell House. Right? That says a lot. The significance of that meeting must never be overlooked. Right? After World War I, the Versailles Treaty placed huge burdens on Germany, and it was as much a stimulus for another world war as anything. Often cited as the underlying reason for Hitler's rise to power, and cited correctly, by the way, the treaty was deeply resented by the German people, whose country was ravaged by its provisions and whose personal situation was ravaged by the destruction of the German mark through wild inflation. It cost the people their homes, their farms, their businesses, their savings and everything. And it's what we face in our country if we don't wake up, America. Franklin Roosevelt did everything he could to get our nation into World War II that began in Germany invading to the east in 1939. All the while, of course, Roosevelt was protesting that he would never send our troops into war. Exactly what Wilson had done to get reelected in 1916. Right? In 1939 was the year that Roosevelt accepted the offer of CFR members to assist in the work of the State Department. Their presence soon became domination. For 2 full years, Roosevelt protested that Americans would not be sent into the war started by Hitler in 1939. He even refused then to alert U.S. commanders in Hawaii and about the Japanese attack that he and his top advisors knew was underway. Right? As a result of what happened at Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Congress declared war on Japan. Immediately, Germany and Italy honored their pact with Japan and declared war on the United States. Right? We were now committed to war against Germany in Africa, against Italy and Germany in Europe, and against the Japanese in Asia, in the Pacific. While Americans from coast to coast were glued to attention about the war, plotters immediately started working toward the next try at world government. It was in January of 1942, in fact, barely a month after Pearl Harbor, that delegates from 26 nations, including our own, issued a formal Declaration of the United Nations. This was the first time the term United Nations appeared. In 1943, representatives of the Allied nations, the US, USSR, Britain, Nationalist China, met on several occasions and agreed to form a world organization after the war. Other meetings were frequently convened. In 1944, a conference was held at the Dumbarton Oaks estate in Washington, and they hammered out the initial draft of the United Nations Charter. And then finally, in April of 1945, actually from April 25th to June 26th of 1945, delegates from 50 nations met in San Francisco to approve and sign the UN Charter. The war in Europe had not yet ended, and the war in the Pacific would continue for another 4 months, 4 more costly months, right? The creation of the United Nations was more important to these men than the war was. And who were these men? Who were the Americans, so-called, who attended this San Francisco conference? There are 2 lists of U.S. participants at that San Francisco conference. One contains the names of 17 men who were later identified as secret communists. Right? The other list contains the names of 43 men who were or soon would be members of the Council on Foreign Relations. The most odious of all of these individuals, of course, was Alger Hiss, a secret communist and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He was the Secretary General of the founding conference of the United Nations, and he was a communist all the while, right? Were there any stalwart defenders of U.S. sovereignty at the San Francisco event? I know of none, right? Indeed, it was Hiss who was given the honor of transporting the charter to Washington, where he presented it to President Truman. It went then to the Senate for ratification. Now, consider this. In 1919, the U.S. Senate took 9 long months before registering disapproval of the League of Nations. In 1945, the Senate debated for 6 days and approved the United Nations. Right? I think that's significant. Across the nation, the idea had been spread, this is 1945 now, that something new had to be tried. Right? Many Americans in 1945 were able to recall World War I that had ended in 1918, and all Americans were aware of World War II that began for our nation 23 years after the end of World War I. With very few exceptions, even our best citizens and legislators felt that something new had to be created in order to keep another world war from starting. There were some senators who had voted against the League of Nations, who were still in the Senate, and they were hounded by colleagues who wrongly accused them, because of their previous attitude against the League, of being responsible for World War II. Right? Imagine. The American people were inundated with the need for something new, that would prevent another horrible war. I can even recall this attitude being shared by my own father, who in time became a very strong supporter of Robert Taft for president and a great defender of Joe McCarthy and so on. But he got sucked into this attitude. Something new had to be done. We had to try something new. Right? And any who were reluctant were looked upon as dangerous partisans for more war. Right? The propaganda was intense, and it worked. The Senate alone got to vote on joining the UN via a vote on acceptance of the UN Charter. The matter was considered a treaty, and the United States Constitution grants treaty approval to the Senate. But a treaty is an agreement between two sovereign entities, right? Two countries, such as our country and Canada, say, right? The UN would like to be a sovereign entity, but it wasn't one in 1945, and it is still not one today. Nevertheless, the Senate alone voted. The House of Representatives had nothing to say, and the vote was 89-2 in the United States Senate. The two negative votes were cast by senators whose names are known to very few. Someday we'll build a monument to these two men. Right? They were Henrik Shipstead of Minnesota and William Langer of North Dakota. The main objections stated by these two were that they believed the world body would have the power to A, send our nation into war, and B, require the use of our nation's military on its call. And that's why they objected. But there were only two of them that did. Right? California's Hiram Johnson would also have voted no had he not been hospitalized at the time. And eventually 4 other senators who missed the vote indicated their approval. So the Senate's approval should be considered 93 in favor and only 3 against, because then there were only 96 senators. Right? Senator Burton Wheeler, a Democrat from Montana, eloquently made the case against UN membership during the 6 days of debate. In part, he thundered, and he thundered. He said, if we enter into this treaty, we take power away from the Congress, and the president can send troops all over the world to fight battles everywhere. Isn't that what happened? Right? 4 days later, he voted to support the treaty. Right? He said that he didn't see any alternative. Even the highly respected Robert Taft of Ohio voted yes. But within 2 more years, he decided that the United Nations is a trap. He said, let's go it alone. But the die had been cast. So what about the UN Charter? May I see a show of hands in here? How many of you possess a copy of the UN Charter? Less than half. In fact, there's more here than I would have guessed, right? Most Americans haven't read the U.S. Constitution, and even fewer Americans have read the UN Charter, right? What's also true, well, let's take a look at the Charter. Now, I should tell you that we have a packet of information out on the table there. It's got several of the documents that I'll be talking about, including a complete copy of the UN Charter. And if you want to get one of those packets, please leave $2 on the table, right? All right. Article 1 in the Charter employs the word peace or peaceful 6 times, right? Hence, the claim is made that the UN is a peace organization. Right? But paragraph 7 of Article 2 authorizes the very opposite of peace. It starts off by saying, nothing contained in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. Well, that's nice, but then it continues. But this principle shall not prejudice the application of enforcement measures under Chapter 7. Right? We go to Chapter 7, and we see in Article 42 that the Security Council, quote, may take such action by air, sea, or land forces as may be necessary to maintain or restore international peace and security. Such action may include demonstrations, blockade, and other operations by air, sea, or land forces of the United Nations. That's the peace organization, right? Ladies and gentlemen, that's war, right? that the UN is authorized to conduct war according to the Charter, the peace organization. Okay, so where would the UN get forces to accomplish the military action that is called for? There are actually two places where the UN Charter answers this question. Article 43 says, all members of the United Nations undertake to make available to the Security Council on its call in accordance with a special agreement or agreements, armed forces, assistance, and facilities, including the rights of passage necessary for the purpose of maintaining international peace and security. Get it? Right? All members will make available armed forces to the UN on its call. That's part of the Charter. The second place where the Charter tells us where troops will be supplied is the very brief Article 25. How any senator who gives a hoot about the Constitution of the United States and his country would agree to Article 25 is a mind-boggler, right? There were, of course, some senators who cared little about the country, the Constitution, and the use of our nation's forces. Yeah, right. But 93 senators approved Article 25. All right? Here it is in its entirety, very small. The members of the United Nations agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the present Charter. That trumps the Constitution. How any senator could agree to that is amazing, right? Some of them, of course, I think were maybe secret communists or internationalists, Council on Foreign Relations members, whatever. But there should have been more than two who saw through it. Right? Okay, so here we are, 93 senators approving this. And the United States is one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and therefore we possess a veto. We can veto a Security Council resolution. Have we ever done so to keep our military from being misused? No, not even close, right? So let me read that Article 25 again, right? Members of the UN agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council. It doesn't say some members or a few well-to-do nations. Its wording is all-inclusive. But how many nations do what it says? And the answer is very few. As far as the United States is concerned, when the UN calls, we answer with troops, right? And supplies and armaments. The U.S. is an obedient member of the United Nations. We live up to the Charter, right? That means not living up to the U.S. Constitution. Is there any sort of fancy legality for shaping troops, for supplying troops to carry out the decisions of the Security Council? And the answer is yes. There is some fancy legality allowing that, right? There was a law passed by Congress that's relied on to convey a sense of legality. That it is totally unconstitutional is clear to anyone who cares about the Constitution, but it's legal. It's the United Nations Participation Act, which was passed by both houses of Congress in December of 1945. Right? Now, I think many of you know that there's been a bill in Congress repeatedly introduced by Congressman Ron Paul to get us out of the United Nations, right? The American Sovereignty Restoration Act, they call it, right? One of its first provisions is repeal of the United Nations Participation Act. In other words, Ron Paul's people understand this thing, and they understand what has to be done for us to completely regain our sovereignty, right? So the act, the United Nations Participation Act, and there's a pamphlet in this packet about that, the colorful one here, that's all about the United Nations Participation Act. It supplies the President with authority to ignore the constitutions which grant Congress alone power to send the nation into war. Right? The first of the two pertinent parts of the United Nations Participation Act says that a president who wants to supply forces for a United Nations standing army would have to get approval from Congress. But there's never been a United Nations standing army, and no president has ever gone to Congress to ask for that kind of permission. Right? But the second pertinent part of the United Nations Participation Act states that a president shall not, I emphasize shall not, be deemed to require the authorization of Congress to supply military personnel to enforce Security Council resolutions. There's no standing army here. This is just sending troops at the request of the Security Council of the United Nations. It's this portion of the act that has been relied upon for 6 decades to send the U.S. military personnel into police actions, limited wars, peacekeeping missions all over the globe. Right? Now, there were a few in Congress who opposed the United Nations Participation Act, such as a valiant congresswoman from Illinois named Jessie Sumner. On December 18th of 1945, while this act was being discussed, she said, "You know, of course, that this measure gives congressional authority for surrendering the American people to an all-powerful world supergovernment. This measure obviously," she said, "authorizes the surrender to the new world supergovernment of enough men and military might to conquer any nation in the world, including the United States." Good for Jessie Sumner. But still in the grip of the attitude that something new had to be undertaken to prevent another war, the House approved the UN Participation Act 344 to 15, with 72 not voting and 1 member voting present. The Senate promptly followed through with its approval. So now, the United Nations could rely on a president supplying U.S. forces to enforce UN Security Council resolutions without any act of Congress needed. Right? On June 27, 1950, a mere 2 days after the communist North Koreans invaded South Korea and started the Korean War, the UN Security Council passed a resolution calling on all members to send troops to the United Nations to aid South Korea. How many UN member nations sent troops as required by Article 25 of the Charter? The answer is very few. Right? The war was essentially a U.S. struggle against the communists. Also, as a permanent member of the Security Council, the Soviet Union could have vetoed the measure, but was conveniently boycotting the UN at the time. And don't tell me that wasn't arranged beforehand, right? Right? President Truman responded first with troops that he had sent to Korea to rescue American citizens who were caught up in the war that had begun, which is a proper purpose of the military. But then he left them there, and he told them to start taking their orders from elsewhere, right? Only a few protested the Truman action. One senator, Taft of Ohio, who was now opposed to the UN, he said that doing so, following Truman's desire to commit the troops to the UN force, he said it was a complete usurpation by the president of authority to use the armed forces of this country. If the incident is permitted to go by without protest, he said, at least from this body, we would have finally terminated for all time the right of Congress to declare war, which was granted to Congress alone by the Constitution of the United States. Right? Now, I can agree with everything in that except finally. I don't think it's finally terminated. We can get it back if we have the guts to do so. President Truman was immediately asked during a press conference whether our nation was at war. He answered, "We are not at war. This is a police action." Right? He was skittish about the use of the term war because he knew the Constitution said only the Congress could get us into war. He later said that if he could send troops to NATO, which he had done, he could send troops to Korea. Right? We've got to take a look at NATO. Right? Right. The UN Participation Act wasn't mentioned, but it was surely the basis for this troop deployment. Tens of thousands of Americans didn't come home alive from Korea, and many more came home wounded. The Korean War, police action, if you will, even saw UN flags flying over our forces. That war has never been ended. There are still 30,000 U.S. troops remaining on station in South Korea even today. My guess is that the United Nations has not given the green light for them to come home. All right, we mentioned NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. President Truman mentioned it. The United Nations Charter, in Chapter 8, Articles 52, 3, and 4, allows for creation by members of the UN to create regional arrangements, they call it, regional arrangements. The first of these was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was formed on April 4th of 1949 by the U.S. and 11 other nations. NATO now has 38 member nations. All right, so this happened before the Korean War. NATO was created. The brief NATO Charter, 14 articles, states that an attack on any one of its members shall be considered an attack on all. That's an interesting thing to get yourself entangled into, right? It mentions that the United Nations 6 times in its 14 articles, right? Secretary of State Dean Acheson, a real lefty internationalist, Council on Foreign Relations type, he told senators who were being asked to ratify this treaty that it was a measure for strengthening the United Nations. He was very upfront about it. But only 13 senators voted against UN participation in NATO. Very few Americans today know that the current war in Afghanistan is being waged under the authority of NATO, right? North Atlantic Treaty Organization, what's that got to do with Afghanistan? Right? NATO's top official directing the operation in Afghanistan is not an American. Right? A few years after the creation of NATO, the same UN Charter, Chapter 8, was cited to form SEATO, S-E-A-T-O, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. SEATO supplied the authorization for the Vietnam War, where many more Americans died and were maimed. No longer did the authorities feel a need to call the operation a police action, right? It took quite a few years, but the Vietnam War's rules of engagement were finally published, right? This is unbelievable, right? Maybe there's somebody in the audience who served in Vietnam. What did those rules of engagement say? Well, first of all, U.S. pilots were forbidden to bomb Soviet-made SAM missile sites under construction, but they could risk their lives flying into missiles that were launched by these sites when they were constructed. Right? Enemy aircraft could not be attacked on the ground, only in the air when they were attacking our planes. Truck depots 200 yards away from the main road were forbidden targets. Only trucks on the road could be hit. Right? Pilots flying over supply ships heading towards Vietnam, North Vietnam, were forbidden to attack them. Right? This is all the way our forces were compelled to fight a war. And then finally, troops were told not to shoot until they were shot at, not to attack privileged enemy sanctuaries, and not to hold terrain that had been won at great cost. Would any red-blooded American politician or military official send men to fight under such conditions? But nobody knew. Nobody knew. Those rules of engagement weren't published for a good 20 years. In spite of the bravery and incredible efforts of our military personnel, the Vietnam War ended in defeat for the United States. The first war in our nation that we lost, right? First war in history that we lost. The next war saw a massive U.S. force oust Saddam Hussein's pitiful army from Kuwait. The authorization for Desert Shield, as it was known, came from a Security Council resolution. After a lightning-quick defeat of Iraq's puny army, the entire operation ceased. It didn't go on to Baghdad. It didn't seek to capture Saddam, not that there was any right to do so. And its stoppage surprised many who should have asked why. Why did they stop? Because that's all the United Nations Security Council resolution authorized. Get Saddam Hussein's forces out of Kuwait. And once you have that done, you have no authorization to proceed any further. Who's running our military? While the U.S. was doing the United Nations will, the CFR saw the significance of what was happening in Desert Shield, and it broke a long-standing policy to issue an editorial comment in the early 1991 edition of its Foreign Affairs Journal. With obvious approval, the Council on Foreign Relations stated about the 1991 invasion of Iraq, this is what it said: "Never before in American history was there a period quite like it. For 48 days, the United States mowed down and moved inexorably toward war, acting on authority granted by an international organization." CFR continued. On January 12th, the Congress of the United States authorized American armed forces to implement that resolution, that United Nations Security Council resolution, right? In between the first Iraq war and the second, which is still being fought, as we all know, U.S. forces responded to Security Council resolutions by sending forces to Bosnia, to Haiti, to Somalia. When the UN Security Council calls, the U.S. dutifully responds. And when a young Army medic named Michael New refused to wear a UN patch and refused to be sent from Germany to Macedonia, where he would be serving in an openly identified UN command, he was court-martialed and discharged. Right? But Michael New was correct. His whole unit of 500 strong should have refused as well, but no one else did. Right after 9/11, which of course was in 2001, U.S. forces went into Afghanistan. We went into Afghanistan before we went into Iraq the second time, as you know. Right? We're just about starting the 10th year of our activity in Afghanistan. Right? Our forces that went into Afghanistan are still there under NATO command. The war has gone from an operation to capture Osama bin Laden, to wage war against terrorism in general, to eradicate opium production, to impose democracy on a people who have no idea what that means, to combating the Taliban, right? You talk about mission creep or mission change, right? Is this a possibility of being at war for the purpose of being at war? I don't see any doubt about that. Then in 2002, a very significant admission was made in the halls of Congress. All right, recall now that the Second Iraq War started in March 2003. 6 months earlier, in October of 2002, when the drums for war were being heard from coast to coast, George W. Bush, right? The 45-member House International Relations Committee met in formal session. Congressman Ron Paul rose and he said, "Mr. Chairman, I move that we declare war on Iraq." And he quickly added, "And I intend to vote against my own measure because I don't think we should go to war against Iraq. But I don't think we should ignore the Constitution that this nation should not go to war without a declaration from Congress." Right? Chairman Henry Hyde of Illinois, a stalwart conservative supposedly, responded to Ron. He said, "Ron, there are things in the Constitution that have been overtaken by events, by time. Declaration of war is one of them. There are things no longer relevant to a modern society. We are saying to the President, use your judgment. Ron, your measure is inappropriate, anachronistic, it isn't done anymore." Can you imagine? Right? So the committee voted on Ron's motion, and the vote was 45 to no to defeat the measure brought up by Ron Paul. It's probably safe to say that Ron was the only one who voted against the measure for the right reasons. Right? 1 week later, the House voted entirely to authorize the President to follow and implement the Security Council resolutions, and the Senate followed suit. Again, the authorization for war was the UN Security Council resolution. Right? In fact, in the packet, I have a copy of that UN resolution. Excuse me. I have a copy of a letter sent to the Security Council by our Secretary of State at the time, no, our Ambassador to the UN, John Negroponte. Right? And what does he say? He says the action is being taken as authorized under Security Council resolutions umpty-ump and umpty-ump and umpty-ump, right? And there's a copy of the letter signed by John Negroponte. That's part of the packet. So, is our military a global cop for the UN? Can anybody decide otherwise? I don't think so, right? Anybody who has any good sense. But now, I don't want you to get the impression that the military is the only problem we have regarding the United Nations, right? I have a copy of a United Nations flow chart. I don't know whether I saved one to show you. Probably didn't. All right, the flow chart is, you know what a flow chart is, all the lines coming down, a box here and a box here and a box there and so forth. And it shows graphically a multiplicity of United Nations tentacles. I obtained the flow chart from the United Nations itself. I visited in New York City. What it shows is a lengthening shadow over all of mankind's activities, right? Virtually nothing escapes the attention of the UN's commissions and agencies and programs. Dominance isn't yet complete, but the intent to make it obvious, make it so is obvious. The UN's own organizational flowchart shows the goal to meddle in the following areas: education, population, children, women, environment, trade, finance, health, food, labor, agriculture, military, science, culture and religion, atomic power, telecommunications, aviation, industrial development, narcotics, refugees, human rights, property rights, money, and I didn't even finish. Right? The UN's flowchart talks about every single one of those and more. James Madison enunciated a principle that needs to be considered here. He said, no one should wait until the threat to enslave has been carried out. He said one should act once the certain knowledge of what is being planned in order to take action before it's too late. Right? Should we not be acting on Madison's wise counsel? I think so, yeah. Right. Other documents. The United Nations, excuse me, General Assembly in 1948 adopted and proclaimed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Widely cheered, right? One of its greatest promoters was Eleanor Roosevelt, who, as the wife of the President of the United States, had personally affiliated with 100 Communist Front organizations, all by herself. She's probably the record holder, right? And all of these were cited by appropriate agencies of the U.S. government. So she's behind pushing this UN Declaration of Human Rights. It mentions all of what everyone indeed should enjoy: life, liberty, property, travel, peaceful assembly, health, education, and on and on and on. But the kicker appears in Article 29 of the document's 30 articles. It says, in the exercise of his rights and freedoms, everyone shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law. Right? Recall the Bill of Rights of the U.S. Constitution? Congress shall make no law. Right? And that very same Article 29 continues, the rights and freedoms may in no case be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. So what rights do you have? Whatever the United Nations tolerates, right? According to their own document. Well, in 1966, the United Nations issued its Universal International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights. I have the booklet here with those in it, right? The Covenant on Civil and Political Rights starts off proclaiming that rights derive from the inherent dignity of the human person. That surely doesn't square with what our Declaration of Independence says. Our rights come from a creator. Right? That's different. But over and over, this covenant proclaims the existence of rights and adds that each shall not be subject to any restrictions except those which are provided by law and are necessary. They go over and over again, they do it. Right? Example, Article 18. Everyone shall have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. 2 sentences later, in the same Article 18, it says, freedom to manifest one's religion or beliefs may be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law and are necessary. You get it? I think you do, right? I think you do. On April 2nd, 1992, when most of the senators had exited the floor late at night, Senator George Mitchell of Maine delayed the proceedings, and with Senator Rockefeller of West Virginia, Stevens of Alaska, Pell from Rhode Island, Moynihan from New York, and Gore from Tennessee were in attendance. They participated in ratifying the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of the United Nations. Right? They did so relying on the Constitution's requirement that only 2/3 of those present shall be required to approve such ratification. Right? So the 6 were there, all right? The 6, let me go over it again. Mitchell of Maine, Rockefeller of West Virginia, Stevens of Alaska, Pell of Rhode Island, Moynihan of New York, Gore of Tennessee. Well, at least 4 of them are members of the Council on Foreign Relations, right? And of course, Al Gore is a great champion of everything that we believe in, isn't he? Right? Now, in this packet, we have the Charter of the United Nations. I have a couple of pages out of the 1948 International Covenant, Human Rights document. I have a page out of the 1966 Covenant. I have the flow chart. I have the letter sent by John Negroponte to the Security Council, citing the authorization of the Security Council to go into Iraq and so forth. So it's all there. Now, the reason I put this together is a lot of our people need this kind of information. You need it to be able to demonstrate to somebody, look, you want to know what the United Nations is doing, right? Is your uncle or your son or your brother over in Iraq or in Afghanistan, why aren't they allowed to win? Why isn't this thing over? Why don't we just end it and say, right? Well, anyhow, I also want to say at this point that the biggest item on the agenda of the John Birch Society right now is Obamacare. We've got to nullify this. But after we nullify it, we've got to get it repealed. Nullification is good, but if you don't repeal it, it can come back, right? So you do this alphabetically, right? N comes before R. Nullification comes before ratification. And you got to do both. Whatever you get some legislator to be interested in the nullification, and there are more and more who are becoming aware of that, okay. And tell them, all right, get it nullified, and then repeal it, right? Make sure it gets repealed, right? All right, so here we have the United Nations. The John Birch Society, of course, has become somewhat famous or infamous for opposing the United Nations, which I'm very pleased about. I'm glad to know that we have that reputation. I'm anxious to see it grow and become more so. But I want not to have everybody drop everything they're doing about Obamacare right now, because that is so important. Just keep in mind that this Obamacare thing is not about health, it's about people control, right? Just keep that summary in your mind and show them that flow chart that they've put out, right? All right, now, what about some of the leaders of the United Nations? In 1964, a fellow named U Thant of Burma, which is now Myanmar, he said, if we are to make the next step toward world authority and then onward to world government, it will be by the growth and authority of the prestige of the institutions and agencies of the United Nations. Such an authority cannot merely consist in a paper constitution and must be based on a certain degree of power. Right? That's the Secretary General of the UN, 1964. 1992, Boutros Ghali is now the Secretary General. He's from Egypt. And in his article called An Agenda for Peace, he said, "The time of absolute and exclusive sovereignty, however, has passed. Its theory was never matched by reality." All right? Is he an enemy of our country? And is he an enemy of freedom? I don't think I have to spell it out. Then we get Kofi Annan from West Africa, year 2000. At the beginning of the 21st century, the United Nations has become more central to the lives of more people than ever. That is not least because state sovereignty in its most basic sense is being redefined by the forces of globalization and international cooperation. Right? Ladies and gentlemen, I could go on. I won't. There's a lot more that can be said about the United Nations, but to understand its roots and to understand everything about it, and especially what has been done to our military, is important, very important. And it should lead all of us to keep in mind the very, very important need to get us out and get the United Nations out of our country. Thank you very much.